we're Canadians, so we shouldn't need a Japanese organization. That's how strong the evacuation forced the Nisseis to think. The Nikkei Heritage Center in Burnaby, the actual center was opened in the year 2000, but the plan or the dream, you might say, or the vision that we had for a center, it goes way back. In fact, the Japanese, all Canadians were all forced to remove when the war started. They went into the relocation camps, and they started to come back in 1950 to Vancouver, to Steveston, or to other parts of the coast. And the only building that was in Vancouver for the Japanese, or the Japanese Canadians, was the Japanese Language School on Alexander Street. And that was handled quite well, because the organization that took over when the war started, they returned it to the Japanese Maintenance Association or Society. So that's how the Japanese Language School opened as early as 1953 on Alexander Street. And most of the community used the language school for all kinds of events, whether it be concerts and it was an old building, but it was the only building we had. So we always, in the post-war era, in the 60s, 70s, as the Japanese Canadians came back from the interior to Vancouver or to the lower mainland, also there were new immigrants from Japan in the 60s and into the 70s. And the JCCA was probably the only major organization, and I was involved in the JCCA as well. But we always talked about we need a place where we can call our own. We want a place where a hall or a meeting place. So we talked about this. Way back, even in the 70s. And I guess most people will recall that in 1970 was, I believe, was the year that the Canadian government declared that our nation was a multicultural nation and not a two-cultural nation. And they encouraged the multi-ethnic environment of the country, and with many cultures, from many countries. So with that, and I think the timing was quite appropriate, but in 1977, the Japanese Canadians right across Canada commemorated the 100th year since the first immigrant came from Japan. That was Mr. Manzo Nagano, came from Japan in 1877. So With that 1977, what we call the centennial year, there are many, many events right across Canada that the Japanese Canadians put on, and it was put on with lots of encouragement from the federal, provincial, and local governments to have this kind of event. It was respecting the multicultural nature. I think it was also respecting what the Japanese Canadians went through during the war. So at the end of the 1977 centennial year, there was a JCCA conference, Canadian conference, held in Winnipeg. And we had gone through many events and in 1977, and I think we came to realize that the Japanese Canadians have a part in our country, or we played a part in our country. Be it was a blemish, it was a black mark, we were treated as enemy people and so forth. So what happened at that conference was some voices started to say, there should be acknowledgement. There should be acknowledgement of the wrongdoing on the part of the government. There should be an apology, and there should be compensation. So that's when the redress movement kind of got started. And at that time, of course, the Japanese Canadians were scattered right across the nation, and we did not have a well-unified national group. So I, with some others, worked to try to bring all the Japanese Canadians together to think and to prepare ourselves to have one representative organization in Canada. And so in 1979, we formed what is now the NAJC, and that was formed in Vancouver. And that year was the last year of the National JCCA. So we formed the NAJC, and that was going to be our shall we say, starting block or starting group to pursue redress and to make ourselves aware of our presence and of our activities and our part in Canada. So in fact, in 1980, we were, Canada was just undergoing, trying to unify the country in that the Canadian Constitution, which was always in England, Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau was trying to bring that back. So at that time, the plan was to include a Charter of Rights in our Constitution. Our Constitution never had a Charter of Rights. And I think it was the Trudeau government that wanted to introduce a Charter of Rights in the Canadian Constitution. The American Constitution always has had a Charter of Rights. It's a government of the people. Whereas the Canadian Constitution is more based on the British format of the Constitution. So we never had a Charter of Rights. But it was encouraged, and the then Canadian government was trying to introduce the or include a Charter of Rights in our Constitution and patriate it back to Canada, where it really belonged. So that happened in 1982. But before that happened, we were one of the groups given the opportunity to voice in Parliament, to a parliamentary committee, what we thought about having a Charter of Rights. So I, with 3 others from the newly formed NAJC, went to Ottawa and made the presentation why we support the Charter of Rights. And our strong reason was, of course, if the Canadian Constitution had a Charter of Rights, then what happened in 1941 may not happen again. So that was our position and when we made that presentation.